No one noticed her sitting alone. That was the cruelest part. Not the hunger twisting low in her stomach, not the way the silk napkin in her lap had been folded and unfolded so many times it was soft as cloth paper, not even the way the laughter at the long tables rose and fell like waves she would never be allowed to step into. It was the fact that this silence was familiar. Erin Vale sat at the far end of the feast hall, where the light from the chandeliers thinned and the heat from the hearths never quite reached. She had been placed there deliberately, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. The feast was in full bloom. Silver platters crowded the long oak tables, stacked with roasted meats, glazed roots, dark bread brushed with butter that melted and ran. Crystal goblets caught the firelight, throwing fractured gold across the vaulted ceiling. Music drifted from the dais where the house musicians played softly, something polite, something celebratory. This was not a party, this was a display. Tonight, the ruling families of the region had gathered under one roof to honor a single guest. The Lycan king himself had arrived just before dusk, his convoy rolling through the gates like a storm no one dared speak through. The feast was not for the household, it was for him, and Erin had no business being here at all. She knew that. Everyone did. She kept her back straight anyway. Her dress was borrowed, too plain for a feast like this, though whoever had altered it had done their best. The fabric clung in places it shouldn't and loosened where it should have fitted. The color, a muted ash blue, was meant to disappear against stone. It worked. Her hair had been braided and pinned low at the nape of her neck, clean and tight. No jewels, no scent oils, nothing that would invite attention. She had learned young how to take up as little space as possible. Across the hall, laughter burst suddenly, loud and bright. A group near the high table leaned closer together, glasses raised. Someone said something amusing. Erin couldn't hear what, and the sound rippled outward, contagious. She did not look. Looking invited questions. Questions invited scrutiny. Scrutiny always ended the same way. Instead, she focused on her plate. She had eaten very little, not because the food wasn't good, but because she was acutely aware of how closely she was being watched. And by whom? Not the guests, the servants. Eyes flicked to her from the edges of the room, sharp with curiosity, suspicion, and something darker. They knew who she was, or at least who she was supposed to be, the girl without a place, the leftover. Erin lifted her goblet and took a careful sip of watered wine, keeping her movements measured, calm, unremarkable. Inside, her pulse would not settle. It had started the moment the horns sounded at the gates. She hadn't seen him yet, not directly, but she had felt it, the sudden shift in the air, the way the hall seemed to tighten, as if every wall had leaned inward to listen. The Lycan king had arrived. They said his presence could change the temperature of a room, that old alphas bowed without realizing they'd moved, that wolves who hadn't shifted in years felt their instincts stir, restless and uneasy. Erin had felt something else, a pressure, low and insistent, like a name hovering just out of reach of her thoughts. She swallowed, forcing it down. It means nothing, she told herself. You're tired, that's all. She had nearly convinced herself when the chair beside her scraped softly against the stone floor. The sound was quiet, ordinary. It should not have cut through the hall the way it did. Conversation faltered. Music stuttered, then recovered, the musicians playing on with rigid smiles. Erin felt it before she saw it, the attention pulling, twisting, redirecting like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Someone was standing next to her, her fingers curled into the edge of the table. She did not look up. She knew better. The seat beside her had been empty all night. No one of importance would choose it. That was why she had been placed here, alone, unnoticed, harmless. The chair shifted again. Someone sat. The weight beside her was unmistakable, solid, unhurried, as if the person had never once questioned whether the space belonged to them. Erin's breath caught. The scent reached her first. Rain on cold stone. Smoke, something sharp and clean beneath it, like steel drawn from a sheath. Her heart stumbled. She told herself not to react, not to draw attention. Whoever this was, some lord, some bored noble looking for amusement, she could endure a few minutes, smile politely, say little, be forgettable. She kept her eyes on her plate. Then a voice spoke, low, even, close enough that she felt it rather than heard it. Erin Vale, her name, spoken correctly, not rushed, not mocked, not questioned, just said. The hall went silent, not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, like breath being held one person at a time. Erin's vision blurred at the edges. No one used her full name, not anymore. Her throat tightened, slowly, carefully. She turned her head. He was already looking at her. The Lycan king sat beside her, as if he had always intended to. One arm rested loosely against the back of his chair, broad shoulders filling the space with quiet authority. He was dressed simply for a man who ruled half the continent. Dark jacket, no visible insignia, but nothing about him was plain. His eyes were the color of old gold, steady and unblinking. They did not roam, they did not assess, they recognized. Erin forgot how to breathe. Around them the room seemed frozen. Nobles stared openly now, disbelief etched into their faces. At the high table, the host had half risen from his seat, caught between standing and kneeling, his expression pale. Erin felt suddenly, acutely exposed. Her voice failed. She tried again. "Your Majesty." The words came out wrong, too soft, too late. A faint crease appeared between his brows. Not displeasure, something closer to concern. "You shouldn't be sitting alone," he said. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a statement, quiet, certain. She glanced instinctively at the empty stretch of table beyond her, then back at him. "I was assigned this seat." "I know." That sent a ripple of unease through her chest. He knew. The Lycan king shifted slightly, angling his body toward her without breaking eye contact. The movement was subtle, but it placed him, deliberately, between her and the rest of the hall, as if shielding her. Murmurs began to stir again, sharp and urgent, but none dared rise above a whisper. Erin could feel them thinking. Why her? Who is she? What mistake has been made? Her hands trembled beneath the table. She pressed them together, forcing them still. "I didn't expect," she began, then stopped. There was no correct ending to that sentence. He studied her for a moment longer. Then slowly he reached for his goblet and took a drink, unbothered by the scrutiny burning into his back. "You were looking at the door," he said, "as if you were deciding whether to run." Heat crept up her neck. "I wasn't." A corner of his mouth lifted, not a smile, something restrained, private. "You were," he said gently, "but you stayed." She didn't know what to say to that. Neither, it seemed, did the room. The Lycan king set his goblet down and leaned in just enough that only she could hear him. "You've been overlooked on purpose," he said. "That tends to make people careless." Her pulse roared in her ears. "I don't understand." "I think you do." Before she could respond, he straightened and lifted his voice, just slightly. "Bring another place setting," he said to no one in particular. A servant moved instantly. The spell broke. Sound rushed back into the hall all at once. Chairs scraping, voices rising, the music stumbling before resuming with frantic energy. The feast lurched back to life, but it was wrong now. Off balance. Every eye kept drifting toward the far end of the table, toward her. Erin stared straight ahead, heart pounding, as silverware was placed between them with shaking hands. She did not know why the Lycan king had chosen her table. She did not know how he knew her name. But as he settled back into his chair beside her, unbothered by the storm he'd caused, one thought cut through the noise with terrifying clarity. Nothing about her life would be quiet again. The servants avoided her after that, not openly, not in ways that could be named or punished, but the subtle shifts were unmistakable. The way hands shook when placing dishes near her, the way eyes slid away too quickly, the way conversations stopped the moment she passed. Erin felt it all like pressure against her skin. She sat rigidly through the rest of the feast, every sense stretched. Thin, the Lycan king remained beside her, present without crowding, speaking little but noticing everything. When she lifted her fork, his gaze flicked to her plate. When she flinched at a sudden laugh, his posture changed, barely, but enough that the men across the table straightened instinctively. It made no sense. She was no one. She had been no one her entire life. Yet here he was, the most powerful man in the hall, casually dismantling the invisible rules that had kept her small simply by sitting where he pleased. "You don't have to finish it," he murmured when she hesitated over a piece of meat. Her fingers tightened. "I wasn't." "You were counting bites," he said quietly. "That's something people do when they're used to meals being taken away." The fork trembled. She set it down carefully, afraid that if she didn't, it would clatter and give her away completely. "I'm fine." His eyes softened in a way that made her chest ache. "I know you are." That was worse. When the feast finally drew to a close, relief and dread arrived together. Chairs scraped back. Voices rose, and people began to move again, but none of them approached her, not directly. They circled wide, casting glances as though she was suddenly dangerous. The Lycan king stood. The hall followed suit, a wave of motion rippling outward as nobles rose to their feet, some bowing too deeply, others too slowly. Erin stood as well, unsure whether she was supposed to, her borrowed dress whispering against her legs. He did not offer his arm. Instead, he turned to her and said, "Walk with me." It wasn't a command. That frightened her more than if it had been. She nodded once and stepped away from the table, aware of the way the space around them seemed to open without effort. They moved through the hall together, his stride unhurried, hers careful to match it. The doors closed behind them with a heavy thud, muffling the noise of the feast. The corridor beyond was quieter, lit by low wall sconces that cast long shadows across the stone. The air felt cooler here, cleaner. Erin released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She stopped when he did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You didn't ask why," he said at last. Why you sat with me? She asked. Yes, she considered lying. Habit urged her to. But something about his attention, steady, patient, made it difficult. I assumed, she said slowly, that if you wanted me to know, you would tell me. His gaze sharpened, not with anger but interest. That's an unusual assumption. I don't have much practice assuming things work out in my favor. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He turned, facing her fully now, and the corridor seemed to narrow. Do you know what people call you? Her stomach clenched. They call me many things. I don't mean insults. His voice dropped. I mean labels. She hesitated. They say I'm unclaimed, that my family line ended quietly, that I was permitted to stay out of courtesy, a lie that had been repeated so often it had hardened into truth. They say, she continued more softly, that I should be grateful. The word hung between them like something sour. His expression darkened. Gratitude is often demanded by those who benefit most from silence. She looked up at him then, really looked, and something in his eyes made her chest tighten painfully. Why do you know my name? She asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small folded paper. He didn't hand it to her right away. He studied it as if weighing whether to burn it or keep it. Because I've been reading reports for the last 3 years, he said, that mention a girl who never quite fits the record. Her breath caught. He held the paper out to her. She took it with numb fingers and unfolded it carefully. It was an inventory list. Names, ages, designations, nothing remarkable, until she saw her own. Erin Vale. Status, resident, lineage, undetermined. Notes, no manifestation observed. Retained at discretion of the house. Her throat closed. That notation doesn't exist for anyone else, he said. Every other person in that category has a conclusion, a transfer, a dismissal, a burial. She stared at the words until they blurred. Why would you be reading this? Because people disappear under labels like that, he replied. Quietly, the corridor felt suddenly too small. I didn't disappear, she whispered. No, he agreed. You endured. Her hands shook. She folded the paper back along its creases, careful, as if it were fragile. If you knew all this, she said, why now? Because tonight, he said, you were seated where you were meant to be unseen. She swallowed. That happens often. Yes, he said, but tonight, you didn't vanish. Something cold slid down her spine. I watched the hall, he continued. I watched where people were placed, who was honored, who was tolerated. His gaze never left her face. And then I saw you. Erin shook her head faintly. I didn't do anything. No, he said again, almost gently. You existed. The words hit harder than any insult ever had. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. A group of attendants approached, flanked by 2 guards. At their head was Lord Harrowin, the host of the estate, his face tight with forced composure. Your Majesty, he said, bowing low, I trust the feast was satisfactory. It was enlightening, the Lycan king replied. Harrowin smiled nervously. His eyes flicked to Erin, then away. We, hope our hospitality met expectations. It did, the king said, though I have a question. Harrowin straightened slightly. Of course. Why was she seated alone? The corridor went very still. Erin felt every eye slide toward her, measuring, recalculating. Harrowin cleared his throat. Miss Vale prefers a quiet arrangement. We believed, you believed, the king interrupted calmly, that no one would notice. The man paled. That was not intentional, the king finished for him. I'm sure. Silence stretched. See that her accommodations are adjusted, the king said. Immediately. Harrowin nodded too quickly. Of course, we will, and, the king added, his voice sharpening just enough to cut. I will be speaking with you further before I leave. Harrowin bowed again, deeper this time, sweat visible at his temple. At your convenience. The attendants retreated, the tension they carried lingering after them like a stain. Erin stared at the floor, heart racing. You didn't have to do that. Yes, he said. I did. She looked up. Why? He studied her for a long moment, as if considering how much truth she could bear. Because, he said at last, people who survive being overlooked tend to see things others miss. Her breath stuttered. And, he continued quieter now, because when I said your name, you didn't look surprised that I knew it? She frowned. I was. You were startled, he corrected, not confused. The distinction unsettled her. I think, he said, stepping back slightly, giving her space again, that you've been waiting longer than you realize for someone to say it. Say what? Before she could ask, he turned toward the stairwell. Rest, he said. Tomorrow things will be less quiet. That was not comforting. He paused at the first step and looked back at her one last time. And Erin? Yes, you won't be sitting alone again. Then he was gone. Erin stood in the corridor long after his footsteps faded. her heart still pounding, her thoughts in chaos. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar curling beneath her ribs. Not hope, expectation. Expectation turned out to be far worse than fear. Fear was familiar. Fear could be managed, compartmentalized, survived. It lived in the body, tight shoulders, shallow breaths, the instinct to stay quiet and still. Expectation lived in the mind. It asked questions. It imagined outcomes. It ached. Erin did not sleep. She lay on the narrow bed in her small room, long after the estate settled into silence, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling where moisture had once seeped through. The room smelled like old linen and soap, safe, unchanged, too unchanged. Her door had not been moved. Her room had not been reassigned. Not yet. That alone should have reassured her. Instead, it left her suspended between two realities, one where the night at the feast was an aberration, a passing curiosity soon to be corrected, and another where everything she understood about her place in the world was about to be dismantled. She did not know which frightened her more. When dawn came, it came without ceremony. Pale light crept through the small window, dust motes drifting lazily in its wake. Erin rose, dressed, braided her hair as she always did. Muscle memory guided her hands, grounding her in routine. She had barely stepped into the corridor when she felt it. The house was awake, but wrong. Footsteps paused when she passed. Conversations dipped, then resumed too quickly. Eyes followed her, no longer dismissive, no longer cruel, uncertain. In the servants' hall, breakfast had been laid out as usual: bread, porridge, a small dish of fruit. Erin reached for a bowl, then hesitated when the woman beside her abruptly stepped back, nearly colliding with another servant behind her. "Sorry," the woman muttered, not meeting her eyes. Erin frowned. "It's fine." But it wasn't. She took her meal to the far end of the table out of habit. Halfway through, a steward she barely recognized approached, hands clasped stiffly in front of him. "Miss Vale," he said, her spine straightened. "Yes?" "You are requested," he said carefully, "in the east sitting room." Her spoon clinked softly against the bowl. "By whom?" she asked. The steward hesitated. "His Majesty." The room went silent. Erin felt it, every gaze snapping toward her, sharp and electric. Her heart kicked painfully against her ribs. I see," she said, rising too quickly. She steadied herself. "Thank you." The walk through the house felt surreal. Corridors she had scrubbed 100 times now seemed unfamiliar, their portraits watching her with new interest. At the door to the sitting room, she paused, fingers hovering over the polished wood. She took a breath, knocked. "Come in." His voice, steady, unmistakable, sent a shiver down her spine. The sitting room was bathed in morning light, tall windows overlooking the eastern gardens, where frost still clung to the edges of stone paths. The Lycan king stood near one of them, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his forearms, as he examined something outside. He turned as she entered. "Good morning," he said. "Your Majesty," she replied automatically, dipping her head. "Erin," he corrected gently. "Sit," she did, perching on the edge of the chair, as if afraid it might vanish beneath her. He returned to the table, where maps and papers were spread in careful disarray. "I won't keep you long," he said, "but I wanted to speak before the house filled with interpretations." Her brow furrowed. "Interpretations?" His mouth curved faintly. "People are very good at inventing stories when they lack facts." She clasped her hands in her lap. "I don't want trouble." "I know," he said. "That's part of the problem." He leaned back against the table, studying her openly now. In daylight, his presence was no less commanding, but different. Less storm, more. "Wait, you've lived here how long?" he asked. "Most of my life? And in that time," he continued, "has anyone ever asked you what you wanted?" The question caught her off guard. She stared at him, searching for the expected trap. "I want to be useful," she said at last. "I want to not be in the way." His expression tightened. "That wasn't the question," she swallowed. "I don't know how to answer anything else." Silence settled between them, not awkward, but heavy. "Then we'll start smaller," he said. "Today you'll have breakfast somewhere other than the servants' hall." Her eyes widened. "That's not necessary." "It is," he said, "because pretending last night didn't happen will only make it worse." He straightened. "You'll sit where you can see the room, where people must acknowledge you." Erin's stomach churned. "They won't like that." "No," he agreed. "They won't." The words echoed ominously. Breakfast was exactly as terrible as she feared. She was seated at a small table near the windows, technically neutral ground, neither fully among the household nor relegated to the edges. The Lycan king was present only briefly, exchanging words with the host before departing for the morning. His absence made everything sharper. The whispers were not subtle. "She's just a girl. There must be a reason. Did you see where she sat?" Erin focused on her tea, hands steady by sheer force of will. When a noblewoman approached, face carefully composed, Erin braced herself. "You must forgive the curiosity," the woman said. "But we were surprised to see you last night." Erin inclined her head. "I was surprised as well." The woman smiled thinly. "How fortunate." Fortunate. The word followed her through the rest of the morning, whispered behind fans and murmured into sleeves. By midday, the house hummed with speculation. By afternoon, it had curdled. She felt it when she entered the gardens, seeking quiet among the bare hedges and stone benches dusted with frost. The air was sharp, biting, grounding. She almost didn't hear the footsteps behind her. "You should be careful where you walk now," Erin turned. Lyra Harrowin stood several paces away, flanked by two other women. Her posture was relaxed, her smile practiced. "I'm allowed here," Erin said calmly. "Are you?" Lyra asked lightly. "Because last I checked, you belonged indoors." A familiar heat crept up Erin's neck. "I don't belong to anyone." Lyra laughed softly. "Oh, don't be naive. Everyone belongs somewhere. The trick is knowing your place." She stepped closer. "You've caused quite a stir." "I didn't intend to." "That's what makes it dangerous," Lyra replied. "Accidents invite correction." Erin met her gaze. "If you have something to say it." Lyra's smile hardened. "You think sitting beside him means something?" "I didn't say that. But you think it," Lyra pressed. "You think being noticed makes you special." Erin's voice was steady. "I think being treated like a person shouldn't be extraordinary." For a moment, Lyra's composure cracked. "Careful," she hissed. "People who rise too quickly tend to fall." Erin felt the truth of that in her bones. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across the path. The Lycan king stood at the garden's edge, his presence immediate and undeniable. Lyra froze. "Am I interrupting?" he asked mildly. "No," Lyra said quickly. "We were just discussing where people belong," he finished. Her face flushed. He turned his attention to Erin. "Are you well?" "Yes," she said. His gaze flicked back to Lyra. "Good." The dismissal was absolute. Lyra retreated, fury barely contained, her companions trailing behind her in silence. Erin exhaled shakily. "You don't need to shield me," she said. "I'm not," he replied. "I'm observing." She frowned. "Observing what?" "How quickly people reveal themselves when the balance shifts." They walked in silence for a moment, frost crunching underfoot. "Something is coming," he said at last. Her heart skipped. "What kind of something?" "The kind that can no longer be ignored." She stopped. "You're speaking as if this is inevitable?" "It is." She looked up at him, searching his face. "You still haven't told me why." He met her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "Because," he said quietly, "the things that have been overlooked tend to become dangerous when finally seen." The wind stirred, carrying with it a strange sense of anticipation. Erin felt it settle deep in her chest. The change didn't announce itself. There was no single moment where the house turned hostile, no shouted accusation or public scene. Instead, it arrived the way rot does, quietly, through cracks no one bothered to seal. Erin noticed it in small things first. A door that used to be unlocked now required permission, a schedule that shifted without explanation, tasks reassigned, then reassigned again, always placing her just a little closer to scrutiny, a little further from privacy. It was clever. She was not mistreated, not openly. Any complaint would sound ungrateful, paranoid. And yet, by the third day, she felt as though the walls were leaning in. The Lycan king remained in the estate, his presence a stabilizing force, but also a catalyst. Wherever he went, tension followed. Conversations sharpened, smiles thinned. Everyone waited for something, though no one seemed willing to name it. Erin avoided him when she could, not because she wanted to, but because being seen beside him had consequences. The looks had grown sharper, more calculating. The whispers had shifted tone. "She's manipulating him. She must be hiding something. She doesn't belong anywhere near power." The words slid under her skin, familiar and venomous. Late that afternoon, she was summoned again, this time not by him. The message was delivered politely, too politely. "The Lady Harrowin requests your presence in the western parlor." Erin stared at the note for a long moment before folding it carefully and placing it in her pocket. She knew better than to refuse. The western parlor was smaller than the sitting room, heavy with dark wood and thick drapes that muted the light. Lady Harrowin stood near the hearth, posture impeccable, hands clasped lightly in front of her. She smiled when Erin entered. "Miss Vale," she said warmly. "Thank you for coming." Erin inclined her head. "You asked to see me." "Yes, please, sit." Erin remained standing. The smile faltered, just slightly. "Very well," Lady Harrowin said. "I won't pretend this isn't delicate. My family has hosted many important figures over the years, but rarely one as observant as our current guest." Erin said nothing. "His Majesty's interest in you has not gone unnoticed," the woman continued. "And while I admire initiative, I worry that misunderstandings may arise." "I haven't encouraged anything," Erin said quietly. "Of course not," Lady Harrowin replied smoothly. "But appearances matter." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You must understand. Attention from someone like him invites assumptions, dangerous ones." Erin lifted her gaze. "About me?" "About everyone," Lady Harrowin said. "My family, this house, the delicate balance we maintain. Erin's hands curled slowly at her sides. Are you asking me to leave? The woman's eyes sharpened. I'm asking you to consider what happens if you stay. The unspoken threat hung between them. Erin felt something inside her shift. Not dramatically, not violently, just a subtle realignment, like a piece finally clicking into place. I've been considering that my whole life, she said. Lady Harrowin studied her for a long moment, then sighed. You're not as simple as you appear? No, Erin agreed. But neither is this. The dismissal came soon after. Polite, cold. As Erin stepped back into the corridor, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something sharper. Resolve. She did not return to her room. Instead, she found herself walking, slowly, deliberately, toward the upper gallery that overlooked the main hall. It was a place few visited, unless summoned, its balustrade carved with old symbols worn smooth by time. The Lycan king stood there, alone, hands resting lightly on the railing. He did not turn when she approached. They warned you, he said. Yes. Did they threaten you? Not directly. A pause. That's usually when they're most serious. She stepped beside him, gaze following his out over the hall below, where servants moved like pieces on a board. They want me. Gone, she said. He nodded. I know. She took a breath. Are you going to let them? He turned then, fully, his attention settling on her with unmistakable gravity. That depends, he said, on whether you intend to disappear quietly. The question landed heavy. Erin met his gaze. I've done that already. Something in his expression shifted. Approval, perhaps, or relief. Good, he said, because this was never about a seat at a table. She frowned. Then what is it about? He leaned closer, lowering his voice. It's about why people work so hard to make you invisible in the first place. Her pulse spiked. You don't think that was coincidence? She said. No, he replied. I think it was precaution. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed behind them, urgent, hurried. A guard approached, face tight. Your Majesty, he said, there's been an incident. The Lycan king straightened. Where? The lower archives. Erin's stomach dropped. That's not a restricted area, she said. It is now, the guard replied. They moved quickly, the hallways blurring as they descended. When they reached the archive doors, a small crowd had gathered. Servants, stewards, all whispering. Inside, a table had been overturned. Papers littered the floor, some torn, others scorched at the edges. A locked cabinet stood open, its contents disturbed. The Lycan king surveyed the damage with a sharp, assessing gaze. Anything missing? He asked. The archivist swallowed. Records, old ones, birth registries, household transfers. Erin felt dizzy. This wasn't random, she said softly. No, he agreed. It was erasure. He turned to her slowly. Someone is afraid of what you might learn. Her breath came shallow. About what? About yourself, he said. Silence fell. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, heavy and undeniable. I don't understand, she whispered. You will, he said, sooner than they intended. He looked around once more, then back at her. They tried to make you invisible, he said. Now they're trying to make you unknowable. Erin's hands trembled, not with fear, but with a rising, unfamiliar energy she couldn't name. Outside, the sky darkened, clouds rolling in thick and low. The house held its breath. The storm arrived before midnight, not loudly, not with thunder that cracked the sky open. It came the way pressure does, slow, deliberate, heavy enough that the house seemed to sink beneath it. Rain pressed against the windows in fine, relentless sheets. The corridors smelled of damp stone and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to memory. Erin sat awake on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't been told to stay put. That was the problem. No one had said anything at all. After the archives were sealed and the servants dismissed, the Lycan king had given orders in a voice that allowed no argument. Guards doubled, doors locked, records moved under watch. He had looked at Erin once, just once, and said, "Don't let anyone decide for you tonight." No, he stepped back, giving her space. "But I won't open it for you," Erin nodded. She pressed her palm to the stone again. This time it yielded, not dramatically, no grinding gears or ancient locks. The seam widened, as if the wall were exhaling, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The air that spilled out was cold and dry, heavy with age. They entered together. The chamber inside was small, circular, its walls lined with recessed shelves. No treasure, no weapons, only boxes, ledgers, bundles of paper tied with faded string, records. Erin's breath caught. On the far wall, a single plaque had been set into the stone. The inscription was worn, but legible, for those whose names were never meant to vanish. Her knees weakened. The Lycan king did not touch anything. He watched her instead, alert, attentive, as if gauging not what she would find, but how she would bear it. Erin moved slowly, fingers trailing over the shelves until she found a bundle marked with a familiar date, her birth year. Her hands shook as she untied the string. The first page was a registry, names written in careful script, families, locations. She found her own. own, Erin Vale. Then she saw what followed. Not undetermined, not retained at discretion. A lineage marker, scratched out so heavily the paper had nearly torn. Beneath it, in a different hand, written smaller, tighter, removed by order. Her vision blurred. There were others, the Lycan king said softly. A handful, scattered. Most never survived long enough to ask questions. Erin turned the page. A transfer order. A relocation that never happened. A notation. Brief. Clinical. Child retained. Observation recommended. Risk manageable, if isolated. Her stomach twisted. They watched me, she whispered. Yes, they decided what I would be. They tried. She sank onto the cold stone bench at the center of the room, the papers slipping from her hands. Her thoughts spun, not in panic, but in furious clarity. I wasn't overlooked, she said. I was contained. The Lycan king inclined his head. That's what frightened them. Silence filled the chamber. Erin pressed her palms against her knees, grounding herself. When she looked up again, something in her gaze had changed. They were afraid I'd matter, she said. Yes, afraid to whom? He met her eyes. To anyone who benefits from power remaining predictable. She laughed softly, a sound without humor. I don't have power. No, he said. You have presence. She frowned. That's not the same. It is, he replied. To people who understand influence. She stood. The air felt different now, lighter, or perhaps she was. What happens next? She asked. That, he said, depends on what you choose to do with what you've learned. She looked around the chamber one last time, then back at him. If I stay here, they'll keep trying to manage me. Yes, if I leave, they'll try to stop you. She considered this. I don't want revenge, she said finally. I don't want to punish them. His gaze sharpened. What do you want? Erin lifted her chin. I want to decide. The Lycan king studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Then, he said, you'll come with me when I leave at dawn. Her breath caught, not with shock, but with a strange sense of rightness. As what? She asked. As yourself, he said simply. No title, no expectations. And the house? She asked. He turned toward the exit. It will survive. They sealed the vault behind them. By morning, the storm had passed. The estate awoke to quiet upheaval. Guards reassigned, guests departing early. Explanations given that satisfied no one. Erin moved through it all with calm purpose, gathering the few belongings she owned. No one stopped her. No one dared. At the gates, the Lycan king's convoy waited, engines idling. He stood beside the open door, watching as she approached. She paused, glancing back at the house one last time. It looked smaller now. You never told me why you said my name that night, she said. He met her gaze. Because I recognized it. From where? He smiled, faint knowing. From a list that wasn't meant to exist. She exhaled, a weight lifting she hadn't known she carried. He held the door open. Erin Vale stepped forward, not into exile, not into rescue, but into motion. For the first time in her life, she was not being placed. She was choosing.